2, 1, go. Yo, this is the Public Land Advocate Podcast coming back to you with episode 4. We're stoked to be releasing our 4th episode, and we're stoked for all of the listeners that we have. And boy, has our listenership increased by an average of 7 listeners per episode from our first episode to our 3rd episode. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you all for making Deer Camp Stories episode 1, hopefully episode 1 of many, a huge success. I know that Steve, my dad, and Chris had a great time filming the episode and sharing it. The love that people put on the YouTube channel was great, and we were stoked that people shared all of that with their friends as many times as they did, and increased the number of subscriptions and the number of people who listen to what we are saying and who are in their own right public land advocates. And this episode is one that we have been hinting about for a long time. This episode specifically deals with money and public land. A topic that we have teased you listeners with many times, especially in our 2nd episode on the Pittman-Robertson Act, where we talked about how the federal government can put money into public land. And now we want to talk about actually how our wallets can help public land. So we're going to do a couple of things in this show. We're going to give you 5 areas where money and public land coexist, and then we're going to give you guys how to use your money through each of those areas. And some of those areas, we actually look at time being equivalent to money. So you don't have to have a huge paycheck to be a public land advocate. You don't have to have a huge bank account. You just have to have the ability and the know-how, which is what this episode will focus on, to be a better steward of public land. That being said, we're also going to introduce a new section for the Public Land Advocate Podcast, New Year, New Us, where we talk about enemies of public land. That's right, there are people out there in political positions around the country that are enemies to public land being successful and being able to be used by the entirety of the public. So we're going to give you guys a rundown. We'll give you a 3-for-1 for a New Year special. So before we get started, I want to talk to you guys again about the importance of public land. I was doing some research into how public lands have impacted the United States throughout history, and one thing that touched home because it affected a part of my family's history. For those of you who don't know, my grandfathers both served in World War II, and one of them served in the Air Force, and one of his prized possessions was his eider-down jacket. And when we look back to World War II, we see that the Sea Duck Flyway was essential to equipping not only airmen, but military personnel in general with cold weather gear harvested from the down feathers from eiders, scoters, and all the way down to the Chesapeake with canvasbacks. And all of that wouldn't have been possible back then in the 1930s through the 1960s without a massive amount of public land access for people to hunt and pursue and cultivate these birds, which needed a large amount of land and resources to produce the down that they would then molt off prior to their migratory patterns so that it could be harvested for our service members. So if you support the military, then you should be supporting public land. I know that that's something that I learned that I wanted to share with everybody, is that without the diver duck species, the eider, which is a gorgeous species of duck, we wouldn't have kept our servicemen and women in World War II as warm as they were able to be. And I remember one of the things my grandfather told me about being in an airplane in that time is just how cold it was. So he was a huge proponent of goose down and down jackets in general, and that stemmed from how they helped him in the war. So just a neat tidbit of history that if we didn't have access to public lands at that time, the war could have turned out much different. I'm not saying that it would have turned out differently, I'm just simply saying it could have turned out different if we weren't able to equip our troops with some of the best material that we had. So if you're a fan of public land, you are also a supporter of the projects that the United States federal government has done on public land, such as working to keep eider and canvasback populations, scoters, all of these ducks that were used for their down during the Second World War in order to ensure that we had cold weather gear. So just an interesting public land tidbit at that to start this episode. But it's not all about what the government does. The government at times can be a great tool, and at other times it can be an inept tool for us as public land enthusiasts. And one of the things that we have to realize is that those who hold the most power for public land is ourselves and the groups that we associate ourselves with. So the goal of this episode is to talk to you about getting out there and making a difference. And I know that a large number of people that I've shown episodes to, that I have talked to public land users about, all talk about one thing in particular. And that thing is money. It all comes down to the money that we spend on public land. And money's a big deal, especially as we're starting to see a decrease in the United States in inflation. Gas prices around the United States are $3 and under, which I know for someone who wants to put lots of miles on their car, it's a big deal to have that drop in terms of like how much is going to go into the tank versus how much stuff I can buy to make my hunts better. So money does do a lot for us, and it is essential to public land. And one thing that we want to talk about today is we're going to go through 5 areas, like mentioned earlier, that we can share for public land with money or time. Because as the great Gordon Gekko said, time is money. So let's get started, because I know that all of you are spending your time listening to what I have to say. And I'd like you guys to know that there are ways for us as outdoor enthusiasts to ensure that our money goes to what we want it to. So the first thing that we can look at is investigating who we are giving our money to and what that money does/goes to once it's been donated. I was talking to a group of duck hunters at a local DU-sponsored marsh near where I live, and their biggest conundrum about Ducks Unlimited was that as a national organization, they weren't sure that the money being spent was being spent where they could see the impact. Because they talked about how DU spends money on habitat in North Dakota, South Dakota, all the way up into Canada, where we have DU chapters as well. And I myself, in full disclosure, am a Ducks Unlimited or DU member. I do think the work that they do is important, but I, just like these gentlemen that I was talking to after a particularly slow day of duck hunting, that I finished with 2 teal and any of the groups around me finished with a big fat 0, it gets frustrating to see the DU logo on so many things, but not seeing what they tout the positive impact to be as hunters who are further south. Now, that led to a great conversation, and actually the first talking point that we have underneath this topic, which is state versus national levels of the organization and why your state level of the organization is better. Ducks Unlimited on their YouTube channel published a video talking about Maine and diver duck hunting. And that's where we started to see that the state level of Ducks Unlimited is actually more effective in terms of conservation that hunters can see and the impact that hunters can see over the national organization because it unites and unifies people at the state level. Now, full admittance, Ducks Unlimited said that not every state that's out there is like the state of Maine, proving that some states lack the volunteerism that other states have, especially from their leadership in the local city chapters to the state chapters. I know that the only things that I see from the Tulsa Ducks Unlimited chapter, where I call home, is that we don't typically see a ton of like things being put out about how to get out there and get involved and making the marshes that have partnered with Ducks Unlimited and the state of Oklahoma better, right? We don't talk about work parties. We don't post about work parties. In fact, I combed through the social media for the Tulsa Ducks Unlimited chapter because Tulsa is one of the largest cities and metropolitan areas in the state of Oklahoma, and most of their posts were infrequent. In fact, that's what the main chapter of Ducks Unlimited said was the biggest thing driving engagement was social media, especially during and post lockdown for the COVID years, was that the more people who were involved in social media, the more that people got out there and the more that individuals did to help what was going on. So that's why we should be pushing for our state level of organization, because their logos are on the billboards just as much as the national organizations are. In addition to that, when we talk about where money goes, every 501c type nonprofit discloses how money that's donated to them is also spent. And when we looked at a survey of Ducks Unlimited chapters at the state level across the United States, we see that a higher percentage of the money they raise is poured directly back into conservation compared to the national chapter, if we talk about it in a per capita basis. If we look at the amount of money that Ducks Unlimited as an entire organization raises compared to, say, the Oklahoma chapter, of course, they're going to give more money to conservation. But where does that money go? It's spread out across 50 states and across specific projects that Ducks Unlimited has. And this is the same for organizations like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, the National Deer Association, the Pheasants Forever, the National Wild Turkey Federation, Quail Forever, Pheasants Forever. All of these organizations at a national level have projects that are distributed across different areas, but each state that raises its money has more impact in the state that the money is raised than the national organization can guarantee for the state. So the first thing that we want to tell you is if you're going to donate money to a major organization, do it to the state chapter. Do it to the chapter that's closest to where you live, that's active, that's out there doing things. Because if we're not being active as state organization members, we're just letting those dollars go to things that we're not seeing. And I think that the DU dinners that they do are great. I've yet to get to one because of issues surrounding like travel and my other job that I do aside from doing the podcast. But I'm excited to go to these state organizations and these state events and talk to people about public land and be the public land advocate out there that we can be. And part of that is talking to people. And we got another opportunity before I went in to have my hip replaced. That's why we didn't have a bi-weekly update like normal, as I had a hip replacement surgery. But I got the opportunity to talk to a representative of the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. And one thing that they wanted to share when it comes to talking about public land is that there might be a great number of organizations for you to go ahead and donate your money to. But what they wanted to tell us is don't count your local Department of Wildlife and Parks or Department of Natural Resources out. And the reason that this individual wanted to talk to us about giving to the state is that states do require money. And albeit they did say that Kansas is one of the best states for funding public land and public land advocacy with the WIHA or walk-in hunting areas, with the federal dollars that are poured into the Marias des Cygnes Marsh, the Quivira, and also the, as I draw a blank on the name, marsh. There's three major federal marshes that are within Kansas. I got 2 out of the 3, right? So that's not too shabby. So that being said, like they say, they do get a lot of federal money, but individual donors to state's Department of Natural Resources and Parks oftentimes fund specific projects that people don't know about. So sometimes, like if you're out there and you see a wildlife area named after a specific person, whether you're in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, right, is the big one. Texas has the Sam Rayburn Marsh, which is, I heard, great for blue-winged teal hunting. I've never been there myself, but I know a lot of people have said they've had great successes there. Was all part of the people who helped get those things done for public land. So he's like, if you want to make a donation to your state DNR, don't count your state DNR out. This is also supported by a couple of DNR employees that I had the pleasure to talk to in Oklahoma. And by the way, all of these employees asked to remain nameless, but they said that they wanted to support public land because without public land, the DNR doesn't have a job. And in their opinion, they said that they write more citations on private land than they do on public, which means that for the amount of people hunting public versus private, public hunters, we are doing much better than people would have us think. So let's keep up that hard work. So one thing that they touched on is actually our second topic, is they said that we need to donate correctly. There's a lot of frustration in the states for people who donate money because they don't ever see a change. And I've talked to a few people who, again, wish to remain anonymous, but they've given 6-figure donations over the course of their life to parties in the state of Oklahoma for changes in public land. And they got so frustrated with this that they took their large annual givings and actually bought private land where they can see their management practices come out better. And to me, 6 figures is a ton of money. But to a state organization with a budget in the millions, if not tens of millions or hundreds of millions, depending on your state, it's not that much money. So we want to donate correctly. And the first place that we can talk about donating correctly as outdoors people, whether you're a hunter, you're a fisher, you're a hiker, you're a camper, is to earmark your donations. And for those of you who are not familiar with earmarking donations, according to the IRS.gov, any 501c3 organization or state organizations have the ability to have funds that are given to them by private donors be directed to specific areas that the donor wants to see supported. So, say you live in Oklahoma, and one of the biggest gripes is that there are pumps on the wetland development units that are broken. Instead of just giving a massive amount of money to the state to try to fix it for the DNR, which there's no guarantee it will go there, individuals can earmark their donations to go to specific projects. Meaning that when they donate the money to an organization, whether it's Ducks Unlimited, Delta Waterfowl, Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, right? The list goes on and on and on and on. We can tell those organizations where and how we want that money spent as part of our donation. This does a couple of things. First is it puts the money in the areas that we want to see, right? We're writing the check. We're handing over the wad of bills, or more likely we're Venmoing or swiping our card now for this. We are going to get that information and get that money to where we want to see it by earmarking it, not just by donating it to those organizations. So that's super important. And what the IRS.gov said is that this is for big spenders and little spenders alike. So it doesn't matter if you're donating six figures in one donation to the state, or you're donating $20 a year for a project that it might take 100 years to fund. Also a part of this is that what we want to do is we want to donate for the maximum. The Oklahoma DNR representative said that last year, in 2023, a mailer went out to people in the state of Oklahoma asking for money to go to protecting public land. And I actually did a video about this on my TikTok, why these organizations aren't necessarily the best to spend your money on. And they agreed with me. Not just because they want money spent in the state of Oklahoma, but because these organizations have no guarantee which public land fights they're going to fight for. So when we think about these big conglomerates of like the National Public Land Trust, right, which is a amount of money being raised to fight for the protection of public land, there's no guarantee that if you donate any sort of money to that it's going to go to your state or your organization. And the worst thing that we can do to feel any sort of hopelessness is to donate to these organizations that we're not seeing the impact in. And that leads us to the point we made previous. If we want to see that impact, we need to donate the money in a way that it's going to go for. Now, how do you do this? Well, it's simple. When you make a donation to your organization at a state, at a like other level, if it's a non-for-profit, you simply write what you want it to be used for, and then they have to provide you proof that that's what that money, especially with nonprofits, is used for. So, that being said, don't get super hopeful that if you donate $10, you're going to see the big change. Also, they said, the DNR representatives I've spoken to said don't get super hopeful. If you donate $100,000, that the change will happen immediately. As with nonprofits, typically they work faster than state organizations, and state organizations work a little slower, but they all try to work to help us with the donations we make, especially more so when the donations are earmarked than they are now. So this also leads us to our third topic, is that states and your money. Why donating to your state is effective. We've talked about earmarking, but one thing that we haven't talked about is that it puts pressure on the states to make change. One of the easiest ways to effectuate change in any state organization, such as a DNR, a Department of Natural Resources, or Department of Wildlife and Parks, is to give money with specifications, because that lets them know that we are not happy about certain things as outdoor and public land enthusiasts. Does it mean that the solution that they come up with is going to be perfect? No. But what does that mean when we say the solution might not be perfect? It means that we need to get involved, which is our fourth topic. No money? No problem. There's alternatives to cash donations that we can be involved in. Most state Department of Wildlife and Parks or Department of Natural Resources have projects that they need help completing that they don't have the manpower to do, that they oftentimes source out to other parties. And what I mean by source is they look for groups of volunteers to work with them to help other projects get done. One of the biggest ways that you can see this is if you have a Boy Scout troop that's active in your area. They volunteer a lot with the Department of Parks at cities to get Eagle Scout projects done. And I'm personally an Eagle Scout. I did not pick a pre-made project from the city, but my Eagle Scout project was to donate a meditation and relaxation space to our senior living facility when I was younger, and it went over very well. The senior citizens loved having a pond. They loved having stuff that was there to maintain their mental health and well-being while they were at a senior living facility. Fellow Boy Scouts that I know across the state that I was living in, which is the state of Kansas, had beautified parks, had installed playgrounds, had installed retaining walls. In fact, one of the people that I knew in Boy Scouts when I was living in the state of Illinois, and he was living in a coastal state when he was much younger, who's now a doctor, was a very successful man, very nice man, very big outdoor enthusiast when it came to donating his money, built a seawall to protect where he was living at the time. And I think that that's something that we need to think about as an individual and as organizations and workplaces. I know that where I work currently, we do a ton of volunteer work inside the community as specific days of giving. And one of those things that you can do if you're interested in public land, and this was passed on to me doing the research in this episode by my father, who used to work, as I said, the deer camp stories for Cargill, is that they would work with the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks in the city of Wichita, and they would have a 2-day Arkansas River cleanup work group where for a weekend, on a Saturday and Sunday, they would go out, they would pick trash out of the river, and they would do this to help clean up the Arkansas River, which for those of you who are unfamiliar, in Wichita is one of its most polluted spaces. So they would get tires, they would get bottles, they would get plastic, they would get old fishing stuff, they would get all this stuff out of the river, and they would do this every year as part of their campaign to be a part of the community. And to us, that is, as public land users, that's great, because I know a ton of people that lived in the Wichita area that fished in the Arkansas River, because there was always rumors that there could be a 50 to 80 pound flathead on the end of your line at any given point in time. Did I ever catch one? No. But that was there, and because Cargill did this, other organizations started to take note and work with different things. I know Boeing had their own project that they did as a volunteer, as part of volunteering while I was living there. And Boeing at the time was, and it still is, a huge employer in the state of Kansas. And then the second part of this is that if you are part of something like Delta Waterfowl or Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, is to go out and do work parties. I know that Pheasants Forever did a big highlight on South Dakota and how individuals in South Dakota completely changed pheasant hunting to keep tourism and individuals coming to the state of South Dakota alive, by not only working with the state as individuals to create better pheasant habitat as outfitters in private land, but also how they could work to donate some of their private land they weren't using to the state, and how they could manage that the best for walk-in hunting. And that completely changed the pheasant opener of South Dakota from where they had years of terrible bird numbers to now being a state to hit. But the impact didn't stop with those work parties in South Dakota. States like Kansas and North Dakota and Nebraska took notice of what South Dakota was doing and started to work on cultivating stronger pheasant populations with these same programs. And as someone who continues to hunt in Kansas, I can tell you that 20 years ago when I was 15 to now, the bird numbers have never been higher for pheasants, for quail, for anything. And it's starting to spill over to where I live now in the state of Oklahoma, where if you are a public land quail hunter or private land quail hunter, if you go out and you hunt upland birds this year and future years, the state of Oklahoma has started to double band quail as part of its research opportunities. And this second band can put money in your pocket if you harvest one. This was brought to me by my physical therapist for my hip. Bo, big quail hunter, big outdoorsman. The conversations we had about public land and hunting helped get me through the hardest 2 weeks of physical therapy that I've had as an individual. And he shared this with me, and I had no clue that the state of Oklahoma was paying up to $150 if you harvested a band that started with a 1.5. And it was blue. That was the big thing. It had to be blue, and it had to start with 1.5. If you harvested a bird with a band that starts with 7.5, you get $75 gift card to pretty much anywhere you wanted to go into the state of Oklahoma, as long as they had gift cards available. I know he told me that he chose a Bass Pro Shops gift card, and he was going to buy ammo for his family and some other stuff that they needed with the $150 from the state of Oklahoma, excuse me. And I thought that was like the coolest thing ever that I didn't know about, because here in Oklahoma, I haven't had the opportunity to go upland bird hunting that much compared to my father, who still trains and raises upland game bird dogs in the Cleveland, Ohio area and is very successful upland bird hunter. So I am connected to that. I just don't have the opportunities here. Will I cultivate those opportunities? I hope so. Because who knows that when you pull the trigger, you could be dropping something that gives you $150. So that is a big thing to go out there and realize that like these organizations are following what private groups and volunteers are doing. And sometimes it's definitely putting a lot of money back into our pockets. The last thing that we want to talk about is the public land hunters versus private hunters and the potential death of the freelance hunter, or is it just a change? And this comes from an Outdoor Limits article that was posted about the death of the freelance duck hunter, where we talk about how there are outfitters that are out there spending tens of thousands of dollars a year, properties being locked up, access is being locked up. Well, how do we fix that is the big question. Outdoor Limits didn't have a solution because they talked about how states move at a glacial pace. That might be true, but if we don't start now, all the land that we have is going to go to these private outfitters. And we need to make sure as public land enthusiasts that we have this public land to share, because the mentality has always been with public land that it will be there. Well, now we're seeing more people than ever on public land. We're seeing more usage of public land, and we're seeing less public land and more land going to outfitters, specifically in the state of Oklahoma, where the Oklahoma Land Access Program lost parcels of land because they weren't giving enough money. And some of these outfitters are paying farmers up to $3,000 a day to let them have access to their fields. And I understand $3,000 a day, that's a lot of money. I'd have a hard time saying no to that. And people who could be in financial straits because of what they need to get done farming and whatnot, that money could be a huge game changer when you have pieces of equipment that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so we need to realize that the only way that we're going to get more opportunities with the changing and the commercialization of not just duck hunting, but deer hunting, turkey hunting, elk hunting, excuse me, is to talk with our wallets to the state. But that wraps it up with what we have to do, right? We need to get involved. We need to donate smartly. We need to earmark those donations. Those are the big takeaways. DNR officials in the state of Oklahoma and Kansas have told us how we can donate money to our state organizations. Ducks Unlimited and Delta Waterfowl have highlighted organizations that do the right thing that we can copy and do in our states, in our cities, in our areas. It's just up to us to get off the couch and do it. And as somebody who loves to do this thing, you can bet soon that I'll be posting pictures on our social media, on Instagram and videos on YouTube of me writing to the chapters of Ducks Unlimited out here to see if we can get work parties started with the state. And I will be doing this because I feel like I have to. That's my calling to do this thing. It's also my calling to preserve public land for the future, and that's what brings us to our new section and our new segment that we're going to do every episode. It's called Enemies of Public Land. And this is a segment that we are going to be introducing from this point forward, where we talk about politicians, activists, and individuals who have negative impacts on public land. And as I've said before, part of what we do and how we do things on public land is something that we can do at the ballot box. And this is important because we're dropping a 3-for-1 on you. Now, in order to make this fair, we're going to cover people from across all political spectrums. So it's not just going to be running down Republicans, destroying Democrats, invading independents, and however other any alliterations that we can get onto this. We're going to be going through them all. And this, because of where I live, I want to start with the state of Oklahoma in this 3-for-1. And we're going to talk about why, in this 3-for-1 special, Mark Wayne Mullen and his supporters Joe Hoven and Steve Daines are our public land enemies of this episode. And just like in baseball, we're going to give them 3 strikes against public land with their policies that they have supported to create them as enemies, right? So, or if you like football, because we're doing a 3-for-1, we're going to give them 4 strikes. They get 4 downs, and they're not going to convert to first down, folks. These 3 individuals, Senator from Oklahoma, Mark Wayne Mullen, Senator from North Dakota, John Hoven, and Senator from Montana, Steve Daines, you are public land enemies, and you should not take being classified as public land enemies lightly, because if you're listening to this podcast and you live in those states, you shouldn't vote for these people. And here's 3 reasons, actually 4 reasons, why they don't deserve to hold the public office that they do. Number 1 is that they have written and authored legislation that limits or attempts to limit public input on public land. Mark Wayne Mullen's own website, which is mullen.senate.gov, in a press release from May 15th, 2023, specifically outlines how him and the 2 other people that I've named, Senator John Hoven and Senator Steve Daines, don't think that the public should get input in how public land is used. That right there should mean that they don't care what we as the public thinks, and we should make sure that they do care what we think when we put them out of a job during their next re-election cycle. They are public land enemies. Strike 1. Strike 2 for them is that they're putting business interests in front of individual and public interests on public land. They are upset with the Bureau of Land Management for protecting more land for diversified public use than they are allowing it to go strictly to grazing or Department of Energy leases, which the last time I checked, Senator Mullins, Senator Hoeven, and Senator Daines, public land is for everybody. Hence, it's called public. It's not considered semi-private. Also, none of those businesses put any sort of dividends back into our pockets as the public for getting access to public lands cheaper than they can get access to other properties. Meaning that as people who have donations in your profile, Stephen Daines from Montana, Mark Wayne Mullen from Oklahoma, and John Hoeven from North Dakota, from cattle ranching organizations, it seems that their money is trying to get you to use the money I spend on public land for interest to make them more money, and I don't get to see a single red cent come back from my taxes. Strike two, you are using taxpayer dollars to make businesses more money and not thinking about the taxpayers. Strike three is that this would also fundamentally change how money from the Pittman-Robertson Act is spent. And what that means for the future is that it would be more able for businesses to use Pittman-Robertson Act money to increase grazing land regardless of the impact that this would have on game species. Strike three. We're not listening to the authority, which would be the Bureau of Land Management. We're not listening to people with doctorate degrees in understanding these game species. We're listening to the money that goes into their pockets. And they're taking not only our money as public land enthusiasts, but money from businesses so businesses can make more money off the money that we've already spent, with no guarantee that they will treat public land with the protection and the necessities it needs to be treated with. Strike three. And strike four for them is that they're all opposed to the public lands rule of the Bureau of Land Management, which means that if they give Department of Energy leases or grazing leases on public lands, that is all they can be used for. And those organizations and those companies can keep taxpayers off of public lands for hiking, camping, stargazing, foraging, any sort of activity you can do on public property. Changing that would keep us off, and it would mean that those organizations who buy those leases for pennies on the dollar would get to use them without having to give any dividends to the public. So that's 3 strikes, 4 downs. Senators Mark Wayne Mullen, John Hoeven, and Steve Daines, you are the public land enemies of episode 4 of the Public Land Advocate podcast. And hopefully, when it's time for your re-election, we see none of you re-elected because you think that the public doesn't deserve access to what the public has already paid for. And your politicians and the people who support you are taking our money and using it to line their own pockets. So, that being said, as we wrap this episode up, remember who our public land enemies are and stay away from them. Don't vote for them, get them out of office, fight legislation that they oppose that would change public land. And then finally, when it comes to money, use your money and your time and your input successfully. This is Professor Mick with the Public Land Advocate podcast, signing off on episode 4. Happy New Year's, happy holidays, Merry Christmas to all of you. I hope all of you are enjoying the new year. I know that I am, and hopefully I'll see you all tuned into next podcast, which we will drop 2 weeks from January 5th, which as I look at the calendar, if I can find it, is going to be January 19th. So tune in for episode 5. Can't wait to see you all there. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Go out and use public land because soon hunting seasons are going to be over. It's going to be time to go find sheds. It's going to be time to hike. It's going to be time to get out there and go fishing or go foraging. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for listening. I appreciate you giving me your time and allowing me to talk to you about an issue that matters. Public land and the public. Have a good day.